Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. You're watching Alaska Weather with us on this 9th of January. Thanks for tuning in tonight. As always, you can get your latest information from us following the show. You'll be able to see all of these graphics on our website at weather.gov/Alaska. Simply scroll down a little bit. You'll see the TV icon. Click on that, and many of the same maps that you see on the show are available to you overnight and early tomorrow morning. As always, you can call the Alaska Weather Information Line. 1-800-472-0391 is that information source with your forecast information and warnings, watches, and advisories as they're issued for your area. Now, as you call that, of course, write down the numbers you're using and save them for next time, and you can simply just punch them in as you go and don't have to listen to all the prompts every single time. In St. Lawrence Island, that's 123. Try it out yourself. Weather.gov, you can check us out anytime. Use weather.gov like that, and you get the entire nation if you want. Weather.gov/Alaska gets you a little bit closer to home really fast. David.Snider@NOAA.gov is how you find me. If you have any questions, you can't find what you're looking for, I'm privileged to serve you any way I possibly can. Let's take a look at the snowfall expectations for southern parts of Southeast. We have winter storm warnings and snow advisories posted for places like Kaufman Cove, all the way up toward Port Alexander. Doesn't look like the snow is going to reach as far up toward Sitka. Not looking for heavy snow there, but south of that it picks up pretty quickly. So about 7 inches around Port Alexander, and this goes through 3 o'clock on Friday. 5 inches in Petersburg, about 10 inches or more possible around Kaufman Cove. And then as you get all the way down to Heidelberg, you start to see that really trail off as conditions get a little bit on the warmer side there. It looks like Ketchikan could be talking about 7.5 inches. Metlakatla, maybe about 1. So big changes there. But up toward Hyder, looks like could see about 5 to 9 inches of snow. So a snow advisory has been added for you. And you can see that showing up here. A large portion of central and southern parts of Southeast are under that winter storm warning. But for Juneau and Douglas, that's a high wind warning. That's going through tonight into about midnight tomorrow, looking for wind gusts that could top 70 miles per hour thanks to the Taku wind. This is a pretty familiar situation, and we've even named the wind because it's so familiar, as cold high pressure is working through the interior and trying to find ways to get out and relieve that really huge cold pool of air. Low pressure is working in, says, well, I'll help you out. It starts pulling that out through the nooks and crannies. That pressure difference allows that drainage wind to start up in Juneau and for Douglas and for downtown Juneau especially. And that's where we're going to see the wind. So make sure that you've got your windows battened down and, of course, your trash cans rolled in, or at least know which direction they're going to blow so you can look for them tomorrow. Up around White Pass and the Klondike Highway, we're looking at a wind chill advisory. That continues there. A little bit of wind through some pretty cold weather. And that means wind chills could easily drop to about 45 below, maybe even 50 below for a short time. Be prepared. Make sure you've got extra gear in your car, in your trunk, in case something happens and you've got to pull over and mind that cold weather for just a little while. Looking back toward the west around Prince William Sound, Thompson Pass also under a wind chill advisory right now. And the 2 yellow shaded areas around the Matanuska Borough as well as the Kenai Peninsula Borough, those are flood advisories, and you've probably heard about those on the news around Big Bend neighborhood. The park recreation area was flooded. They're still dealing with some parts of the subdivision that are closed and water in homes right now. So not a good situation there. Make sure you stay out of that flood water and again, never cross flooded roadways as always. And up around Willow, the borough's doing some work today. Good news there. They're trying to get some of that under control, but an ice road has been built. So working towards some solutions there, and it sounds like things are at least moving in the right direction. So good luck, and thanks to the crews working on that and helping everybody out. Up across the east, the eastern Alaska parts of the mountains, mainly the passes there, the Toke Cutoff all the way up toward Northway, and up around the Deltana and Tanana Flats region. As you're heading north on the Parks Highway, you're probably going to run into some wind that's really going to take a toll on you if you're outside in it, because the air temperatures are pretty cold. So wind chill advisories there for the central interior all the way up toward Bettles and out towards Selawik Valley and the Baldwin Peninsula, as well as the lower Yukon and Yukon Delta region. Every one of these places is mainly watching the wind chill, and a little bit of wind through that very cold air could push those wind chill feels like indices. What it feels like on your skin is what really counts, 45 to 55 below. Again, a short amount of time out in that. That's frostbite material, 10 minutes or less, so be extra careful there. We love to show you the FAA weather cameras, right? And we know pilots around Alaska love these, so I wanted to make sure you knew about this, a new camera that has been added to the map. And if you're a daily map user, you probably knew about it before I did. This is Sand Point, a place that has not had a camera for a long time. This is great news. So this is what it looked like out at Sand Point this afternoon, looking to the south into the glare of the sun, and of course a lot of clouds working through there. Conditions fairly wet, if not a little bit icy in the region, but that is indeed Sand Point. So great news. Thanks to the FAA for that. That is wonderful work. As we look out across most of Alaska, what we're seeing here, of course, is the cold showing up in the satellite picture as detected, with low pressure working in toward Sand Point and some of those clouds kind of creeping in there. Kodiak covered up with cloud cover, southern parts of southeast under that new wave of weather coming in there. Some of that could bring us heavy snow. We have a dying area of low pressure here west of St. Paul from Shemya to Adak, a new weather system moving in very quickly from the south. Each one of these systems here has the potential to stir up the wind and a new round of winter. Now, this weather maker is moving off to the north and west, but it's going to sling a front toward Bristol Bay, so we're going to keep watch on that. This weather maker is helping to drain out a lot of the cold air, and this moisture moving in is what's going to produce the snow. So a busy weather map this afternoon, high pressure across the Yukon, still the big story there, and the weather maker in whole, because it's the cold air that is affecting each one of these systems in part. At 1,038 millibars, it stretches all the way up toward the North Slope and sitting right over Utqiagvik. The next wave and the strongest push of weather right now developing is 967 millibars south of Shemya. Out over the Gulf, 990 millibar low there is going to crank over toward the southern parts of southeast tonight, with a little bit of rain and snow moving in initially for places like Metlakatla and Ketchikan, but north of that, it's going to be an efficient snowmaker, it looks like, for our friends all the way up toward Cake and Port Alexander and east toward Hyder. High pressure sits in the same old spot. It even strengthens a little bit. And each one of these waves I've drawn in here is a trough of low pressure that will help to focus those drainage winds in for the Matanuska borough there, especially around Palmer, for the Copper River Delta, and for the Taku wind there. As low pressure develops out across the west, we'll see some snow showers around Bristol Bay. You'll also see the low there just north of the Aleutians. That's that same system. It's still deepening, periods of rain and likely some mixed precipitation on the west side, probably gales to low-end storms as that's working eastward. That front won't be quite as strong as it makes its way to Bristol Bay, but we can expect to see a mix of rain and snow across the region. A chance for some blowing snow to develop around the Bering Strait region as that pressure gradient tightens up, and we should expect similar conditions there around White Pass and around Thompson Pass, thanks to high pressure not budging around the Alcan border at 1,040 millibars. Watching for snow to creep northward just a little bit more tomorrow afternoon, probably not really making it into Juneau with any great amount of snow at this time. It looks like the wind will prevail, and those northerly winds coming down Lynn Canal are going to be strong, and seas are going to be high, looking for those to be around 10 to 14 feet if you think you're going to get out on Lynn Canal tomorrow. Low pressure out in the west drops to 952 millibars. It looks like we're going to get some more wind around St. Lawrence Island. Snow showers all the way down toward Macoriac and Nunivak Island, and you can see that front starts to fall apart as we get into Saturday. Wind is still an issue for our outflow areas there from the Matanuska, Knik Valley area and the Matanuska Valley itself toward the Copper River Delta and the Taku wind. And high pressure, again, strengthening is going to help make that happen. The 962 millibar low out there also driving in that southerly flow. We are starting to see the signs of a pattern change, but it is going to be about a week-long process probably to get there. In the meantime, temperatures in the morning are just going to be cold like they have been, maybe not as nasty cold as they have been by a degree or two, but it's not going to change that much. Look for levels around 50 below for Fort Yukon to Eagle and Northway. Fairbanks, you're looking at 42 below, 25 to 35 below across the North Slope. Nome, about 8 below. Southwest, you're looking at temperatures from 5 below in Bethel to about 10 above around King Salmon and Dillingham, 26 above in Kodiak, 20s and 30s for the Alaska Peninsula toward Dutch, and 33 around St. Paul and St. George. High temperatures tomorrow afternoon, anywhere from 30 to 45 below southeast, teens 20s, 30s way down south, south central, close to 0, 13 in Homer, 32 in Kodiak, and 2 above in Nome.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And on to your aviation forecast now for Friday morning. Watch for IFR concerns across the southwestern Capes and a large part of Bristol Bay. Marginal concerns will push a little bit further north into Etoll and Strait, out toward the southern extent of St. Lawrence Island and out toward St. Matthew, where we pick up IFR once again, wrapping into low pressure here across the central and western Bering. Marginal weather will start to move in across the central and eastern chain. A little bit of a break as you move across the Alaska Peninsula Pacific waters and over Kodiak Island, with IFR spreading into southern parts of southeast. Snows expected here with IFR across the extreme southern sections, including Ketchikan, Cake, and Klawock, and probably areas into the Dixon entrance for the time being. As we get into the afternoon, that area will diminish. Some improvements are expected with hit and miss marginal across the Gulf. We'll really get back into it as we get into southwestern Alaska with widespread IFR moving in during the afternoon for Gamble and Savunga out towards St. Matthew, Macoriac, and down to southwestern Alaska and the Capes. Probably moving very close to, but not over, Bethel during the afternoon, and then working its way up the valleys toward Lake Iliamna, Dillingham, and King Salmon, kind of hit and miss with everywhere on the Alaska Peninsula really experiencing at least marginal concerns throughout the day. Adak and Atka will be up and down. South Central, the interior, the North Slope, the West Coast, primarily okay for your Friday afternoon, but that's gradually going to change as we get into the weekend, with IFR setting up across St. Lawrence Island and then back into the Yukon Delta and the Kuskokwim, of course. Bethel goes down. It looks like King Salmon and Dillingham and Kodiak go down, and many areas across south and west will see improving weather from west to east as we go through your Saturday afternoon. Southeast looks to be VFR as we get into Saturday morning, but remember, we're going to be talking about turbulence in a minute. Outflow conditions will be expected with a lot of that cold air draining out across coastal locations, and some of that's also moving across the central and western parts of the Seward Peninsula and the Yukon Valley there, so plan on some changes as we go. For Saturday afternoon, IFR sets into Nome, Unalakleet probably going down at least for a time during the day. Gamble and Savunga back to marginal. Macoriac and westward toward St. Paul, St. George, all the way down toward Nikolsky and Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, looking at IFR by Saturday afternoon, and another wave coming in behind that with marginal concerns across the western chain and hit and miss around Cordova and probably some of the coastal areas of southeast as we get into the afternoon. Here's your pass conditions in detail now for Anaktuvuk and Adigan Pass, and really most of our passes. High pressure is firmly in charge, so caveat would be isolated areas of low-level stratus or maybe some ice fog in the region. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass look to be mainly okay. Rainy Pass, Windy Pass, and Isabel Pass should all be VFR for the most part. And as we get out toward Mentasta Pass, again, looking like that'll be okay. Tanita Pass and Portage Pass at this point look to be okay. Remember, though, we're dealing with portage winds, or not portage winds, outflow winds around many areas that are prone to those gap flows when we have substantial high pressure in the wintertime. So again, if you're flying through those known tricky spots, keep that in mind. VFR is not going to be the whole story here. Chilkoot and White Pass, certainly some of the areas that we're going to see some gusty winds in the region, and VFR is expected there. Freezing levels show that low pressure in the west is pulling in a lot of warm and wet air across the southern parts of the Bering. We're looking at 2, 4, and even 6,000 foot levels coming up across Adak, eastward toward Nikolsky and Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. Not quite to the Alaska Peninsula just yet. The surface freezing lines being nudged northward to St. Matthew, and then south of Kodiak all the way across the southern outer coast with a 2,000 foot level there creeping in on the Dixon entrance of southeast. Everywhere else sub-freezing, of course. Icing potential growing a little bit around Kodiak tomorrow. It looks like the levels coming up to about 3,000 feet and higher for some considerable moderate, especially across the southern half of the island. Elsewhere up the west and southwestern coast, isolated moderate, generally between about 8 and 3,000 feet. Southern parts of southeast looking at increased icing potential, isolated moderate, but below 10,000 feet. The jet stream is showing some signs of change. That's good news if you're tired of the cold. High pressure across the west coast there, pushing northward there, deepening trough in the west. Wind speeds on that 100 to 120 knots with high pressure over the central Pacific. A stronger westerly flow across the North Gulf, 100 to 120 knots. And again, that's all flowing that cold air into the Pacific Northwest and the western U.S. High pressure across the North Slope dragging in colder northerly flow for the interior, so it will stay cold for the meantime. Low pressure in the west keeps that westerly flow moving across the west coast and across the Gulf of Alaska. No big change at 3,000 feet. Strong east to westerly flow, though, across the Yukon Valley to the west is notable, though. 40 to 50 knots there at that level produces a chance for considerable moderate to isolated severe turbulence below 4 to 5,000 feet in that region, and chop for most of southeast and the Aleutians and the peninsula.
I'm new to astronomy, and maybe you are too. It can be a bit overwhelming. The sky is a constantly moving sea filled with stars and galaxies, nebulae and planets and comets, and even orbiting things like the International Space Station. To find these things, you need to orient yourself in the night sky, which can be tough because the sky is always moving. Well, some of it is. The bottom of the sky is the horizon, and the top is the zenith. These never move, and neither does the North Star. To find it, look for the Big Dipper. It's one of the most recognizable shapes in the sky. The Big Dipper is not a constellation, but an asterism. It's part of Ursa Major, the Great Bear. The two stars on the end of the bowl are Merak and Dubhe. Using those, you can draw an arrow right to Polaris, the North Star. Now, facing away from Polaris like I am now, east is on your left, west is on your right, and you can look up toward the zenith or down toward the horizon. And now you know where you're pointing when you keep looking up.
Space weather affects technologies.
Clear on your final.
As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
The Space Weather Prediction Center has had a long-standing relationship with the power industry, so they've been aware that solar storms, the geomagnetic storm piece of that, can affect the operation of their systems and induce extra currents and loads on those systems that can either trip those systems offline or in the worst of cases, cause damage. That relationship goes back for several decades. In fact, a big incident in 1989 where part of Quebec was tripped offline that affected something like 6 million customers for about 9 hours. I think that really raised the awareness in the power industries.
When we get the alert, we watch the grid and start looking for issues. Are we seeing a decline in voltage? Are we seeing equipment failures? And we readjust the system to try to mitigate those problems, try to keep the lights on and keep it from going out.
Averaging about 500, 550 kilometers per second.
If we didn't have this early warning, we wouldn't see it until our sensor saw it. Getting more information quicker and faster before the storm hits, not during the storm, is a big improvement.
In the long term, I think what we need and what we're moving toward, the U.S. as a whole, is better modeling, fully understanding this phenomenon, understanding how it would impact specific systems.
Rather than actually experiencing a storm, we can simulate storms in our software and see what the impact is. We try to get ahead of it. We always plan that if there's an outage, how can we keep the lights on? What's the best process to prevent it?
In the end, 5-10 years from now, there's going to be a whole mix of operational procedures driven by what we do on prediction and warning. And then there also will probably be some level of hardware controls to ensure the reliability of the grid.
Space weather affects technologies.
Clear on your final.
As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
There's different types of impacts on communication systems, and the HF we call the high frequency, which is that band of communications 3 to 30 megahertz. But it's a very important band of radio communication because it's used widespread. It's used, for example, by the airlines.
HF radio is most commonly used for position reporting when you're going across the ocean airspace, which is devoid of radar. And ATC can't see you, so it's up to you to report your position and your altitude and your speed.
HF works great most of the time, except during a big flare. And during a big flare, that HF communication capability could be gone within a minute or two. So as soon as we see something happening in there, or we see a flare, it's one of the first things we do is alert the aviation community, hey, big flare, HF's going to be impacted.
Once we know that there's an event going on, then the aviation industry and the airlines can react to that. They can alter their routes over the poles. They can lower the altitudes that they're flying at, or maybe decide not to fly at all in the interest of the passenger safety.
So that's just one example of how HF is used, but the emergency response community will use it a lot too. It's one of their primary backups.
When you've lost connectivity between certain government agencies, it gives you that long-range coverage to talk from out-of-state to federal governments or from the FEMA locations to the state emergency operations centers.
So if you've got a big hurricane impact in the coastline, whatever big city, we've got the cell towers down and whatnot, we've got emergency communication folks in there. Those folks are very familiar with space weather and how it impacts their systems.
Here in recent years, it was used during Katrina when we had a lot of communications outages down there. It was also used during Hurricane Ike. There was an outage of the telephone circuits with the Texas State Emergency Office, so it was used in both of those situations.
So when we talk about backup, especially for the airlines, typically they'll have SATCOM, so that'll be satellite communication.
The satellite technology that emergency responders use could be GPSs, could be satellite phones, satellite data terminals.
Space weather events can impact SATCOMs. The impact can range from a nuisance to loss of a spacecraft. So we will give them the heads up. If we have space weather events, flares, whatnot, they need to know what's impacting their systems. Situational awareness is key. Time is of essence to these folks. Again, it's life and death.
And now, marine weather around Alaska. Back with a look at your sea ice edge now. You can see there's still marginal ice very close to St. Matthew. We don't have that little patch on the south side as we did yesterday and the day before. Ice edge still well away from St. Paul and St. George, but right now it looks like continued growth southward probably is going to be slowed down a little bit with successive storms working their way up from the south and southwest. But ice continues to grow. It's just not moving as far southward as quickly as it has been. You can see quite an extensive coverage there south and west of Point Newenham, as well as areas generally north and east of Port Hayden. Also seeing growth there around Chignik and into northern parts of Cook Inlet, where reports of fairly thick ice have been sent into the Alaska Sea Ice Program. As always, you can check this out for yourself, weather.gov/Anchorage/ice. Into southeast now, we've been talking about wind moving down through the Lynn Canal and also through the Taku Valley. You can see that reflected in the marine areas there in the Lynn Canal. There are 50-knot winds out of the north, gusts to 70. Northerlies in Stevens Passage, 35 sustained with 7-foot seas there, 14-foot seas in the Lynn Canal, 6-foot seas in Clarence Strait, also looking at some strong gusts, and then offshore winds through all of the areas. And you can see out of Yakutat, certainly an example of those stronger winds. They're going to be relatively isolated, but certainly intense. 40 knots there with 12-foot seas and some stronger winds there out of the bays and passes, so make sure you're taking that into account if you're going out. South of Cross Sound all the way down the outer coast, northeasterlies 20 to 25, seas 11 to 13 feet. Gusts still possible there in the Lynn Canal for Saturday to 55 knots, 11-foot seas expected, 9-foot seas in Stevens Passage, and 20 knots with 5-foot seas in Clarence Strait on Saturday. For Friday in South Central, north and easterly winds coming down Cook Inlet, 10 knots over the ice there with 2-foot seas in open waters, 5 to 6-foot seas further down, 25 knots sustained there. North and westerlies coming off of the Kenai Fjords and out of the Barrens. Northerlies in Prince William Sound, gusts to 50 though, including areas around the Copper River Delta. That could produce 7-foot seas. A little bit of a shift with northeasterlies developing on Saturday. Northerlies inside of Prince William Sound, 10 to 25 knots coming down Cook Inlet, and you're looking at 7 to 8-foot seas there on Saturday in the southern parts of the inlet. As you head out west toward Kodiak Island, easterlies in Shelikof Strait, 20 knots. Northwesterlies coming off the island at 20 knots, 9-foot seas there. 12 to 17-foot seas heading out to Sand Point, 30 to 40 knots developing, also 30 to 40 north of the Bering Sea coast. Some of that's over the ice, but 9-foot seas there in the open waters down the coast. And look for those southerlies to pick up a little bit more as we get into Saturday. 15 knots over Bristol Bay, northeasterlies Shelikof Strait with 6-foot seas, northwesterlies from Chignik all the way down to Perryville and out toward Kodiak Island with 11-foot seas on Saturday. Now for the Aleutians, it's going to be a busy couple days with west and southwesterly winds cranking up to 40 and 50 knots. Looking for higher seas out around Kiska and Shemya, 27, maybe 24-foot seas heading out to the west. And then from the central chain eastward, look for 15 to 29 footers. Some of the stronger ones will be on the south side of the Pacific coast there, 40 to 45 knots there on Friday. You can see the bulk of the higher seas move off to the north by Saturday afternoon. Winds respond as well. West and southwesterlies, you're looking at anywhere from 13 to 22-foot seas throughout the entire chain with the highest out in the west. Pacific coastal winds there looking at about 18-foot seas with south and southeasterly winds at 30 knots on Saturday. For the west coast, easterlies blowing offshore. Some of this could be a little bit strong at times with a nasty wind chill, 30 to 40 knots out of the east, and winds coming up in St. Paul and St. George to 40 knots. With 16-foot seas, easterlies around St. Matthew, 45 knots with an 18-foot sea. As we get into Saturday, southerly winds there around St. Matthew, 30 knots for St. Paul and St. George, 16 to 27-foot seas. That's coming up again as that storm and the higher seas move northward. Over the ice, east and southeasterlies closer to the coast over Savunga, 30 knots there out of the south and east. For the Beaufort, a north and westerly wind, 5 to 10 knots. From Point Barrow all the way down to the Chukchi, it's an easterly flow, 10 to 25 knots all over the ice for Friday, about 20 to 30 knots there for your Saturday, about 25 knots west of Wainwright there, a southeasterly flow again in the Bering Strait at 30 knots, and easterlies for the Beaufort, 15 to 20. Recapping tonight's weather, a lot's going on in southern southeast. We have winter storm warnings for many of the coastal areas out toward Point Alexander. Not so much for Sitka, not expecting heavy snow there. But for areas around Hyder, 5 to 9 inches of snow with a snow advisory. Otherwise, anywhere from about 5 to 10 inches of snow for many areas across the central and southern parts of the Inside Passage. A wind chill advisory for White Pass, a high wind warning for Juneau and Douglas there with gusts over 70 miles per hour. Tonight, a wind chill advisory for the Thompson Pass area, so travel carefully. Watching for some patchy low vis across some parts of the interior, but wind chill advisories continue for the west and southwest as we go into the next couple days. Stay warm.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.